Before you ever opened your eyes, a whole universe had already been moving, stars dying to make your blood, oceans carving the ground where you now walk, cities rising and falling without your name. You were nowhere and everywhere at once, scattered as dust and waiting to be gathered. And one day, each of us will step back into that unknown. Could what came before birth feel like what comes after death? Across ancient caves, frozen mammoths, star ashes, forgotten diaries, and signals from the dawn of time, we search for clues. This journey is not about easy answers, but about wonder, what it means to have come from silence and to return there. Join us as we walk through the world's oldest memories and face the most haunting question of all. What if before and after are the same endless place? Imagine, for a moment, the space before you were anything at all. The long stretch of years that carried on with no sense that you would one day arrive. Time that was not empty, but full and quietly alive. The world already turned beneath skies you had never seen. Winds moved across valleys and ridges shaped by forces older than stories. Oceans shifted, tugged at the edges of continents. Carved cliffs and beaches where no one yet knew your name because you did not yet have one. Before your first breath, before the small sound that would mark the beginning of your being. There were seasons upon seasons, entire ages filled with motion and change, as if the earth had been rehearsing for lifetimes, waiting without knowing it was waiting. Think of the oceans first. They rolled and broke in endless rhythm long before memory, long before the first photograph or word was ever pressed to paper. Salt water covered most of the planet, rich with life both strange and familiar. Creatures with translucent bodies drifted in the dark, lit only by their own faint glow. In 1960, when the bathyscaphe Trieste descended into the Mariana Trench, explorers Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh found that even 7 miles down in that silent blackness, life flickered. But that was long after you were born. Imagine instead those depths untouched by human eyes. Whole kingdoms of lightless calm and hidden movement, existing with no witness and no need for one, above those seas. Continents moved so slowly that the change could not be felt by any single being. Yet over millions of years it redrew the face of the planet. Mountains rose and wore down. Ice came and went. Deserts formed where oceans had been. Long before your birthday, before your parents' birthdays, before even the first humans looked up at the stars, these slow, restless motions were already at work. The air was older than your blood. The oxygen in your lungs was shaped by ancient oceans and the first living cells that learned how to breathe. Somewhere in this deep past, life that would one day give rise to you flickered into being. Not you, not even your kind, but threads of possibility. Long before a woman held a newborn and whispered its name, before any line of ancestors formed behind you, there were creatures that struggled and failed, lines that ended without a trace. Countless lives lived and vanished, trilobites scuttling across Cambrian seabeds 500 million years ago, ammonites spiraling through Jurassic waters, giant dragonflies in carboniferous swamps, all going quietly into the long forgetting. They left no grief that you could feel, but they cleared a path through time. You arrived because so many others did not. The earth itself turned on through all of this. There were storms that stripped coastlines, volcanoes that painted the sky red for years, meteor impacts that reset the balance of life, and still the planet endured. Forests grew where glaciers once sprawled. Flowers bloomed where once there had been only stone and moss. The grasslands you know as common were young once. The birds above them had taken flight only after ancient lizards with teeth and wings disappeared. Entire ages passed and passed again, each one thinking itself final because there was no one to think otherwise. Human history, too, the part we call our own, is older than we easily imagine. Before you were born, before your parents or grandparents, empires rose and fell. Ancient farmers planted grain along the Nile and the Tigris. Builders raised stones at Göbekli Tepe before the invention of writing. Hunters left handprints on cave walls in France some 30,000 years ago. Those hands belonged to people who would never know you, but still, in some quiet way, cleared the air you now breathe. They tamed fire, named rivers, mapped stars. They lived, loved, feared, and died, and the memory of them has drifted forward to meet. You, though, they never meant it to. Even the space above the earth has been long awake. The stars you see tonight were burning before there was any plan for you. And some are already gone, their light only now reaching the place where your eyes will one day look. The atoms inside your body, carbon, iron, calcium, came from those same stars. Born in explosions so fierce and so far away they defy imagining. Before the first breath you will ever take, you are already scattered across galaxies. Pieces of other worlds and other times waiting to gather. If you close your eyes now, you might almost feel it, that long, patient unfolding. No darkness really, just a field of motion, soundless, but not silent. Waves moving under a moon, wind across ice and grass. Footsteps of creatures long vanished. The slow hum of tectonic plates and the beating of rain against rock. Time did not pause for your arrival. It kept its rhythm, wide and deep, until the day someone would hold you close. Until lungs would open and fill for the first time. To remember, this is not to feel small in a frightening way, but to understand that before we begin, the world is already whole. We step into a story already running with its oceans, winds, and endless migrations. And just as others ended so that we could begin, one day we too will leave space for what comes next. In this way, the before and the after hold hands quietly, waiting for each of us to arrive, to breathe once, and then to pass the breath along, beneath the restless glitter of waves. There lies a darkness older than anything we can hold in mind, a place where time itself seems to move with a slower, heavier breath, and where life began long before it found its way onto land. The oceans, spread across the planet like vast and patient memory, have always been a cradle and a keeper, a silent country older than mountains and more enduring than cities. Imagine standing at the edge of some wind-worn cliff and looking out to a sea with no end. And then imagine not just its surface, but the miles and miles of water falling away beneath you. Layers of salt and current and cold stacked until light can no longer reach. It is in those depths that the first living things took shape, soft-bodied and uncertain, drifting in darkness and learning. Without knowing they were learning how to survive, if you could go back far enough, perhaps 500 million years, you would find the sea crowded with creatures whose shapes would seem both alien and beautiful. Trilobites scuttled along the floor with jointed legs and polished shells. Tiny armored pioneers of the Paleozoic, their glassy eyes catching glints of the faint light that filtered down. Ammonites floated through ancient tides, their spiral shells curling in perfect golden ratios, rising and falling with currents that swayed like breath. Strange jelly forms, not the clear bells you see today, but weirder. With frilled edges and pulsing bodies drifted slowly, some glowing faintly from within. No human eye would see them for an age so long it outlives imagination, yet they flourished, fed, died, and sank back to the seabed, where their remains built up into limestone that now frames quiet coastlines. Even now, the oceans hold lives that barely seem to belong to the same world we know. There are fish that make their own light, with teeth like glass shards and lures that swing gently from their heads. There are fields of giant tube worms clustered around volcanic vents, living not on sunlight, but on chemical fire rising from the Earth's own cracks. These beings thrive in blackness, where pressure would crush steel, and where the water runs hotter than boiling, and then falls to freezing only a few feet away. It is easy to forget that we, the so-called land creatures, are late arrivals. The ocean has been alive for uncounted generations. Our curiosity about this deep kingdom grew slowly, as if we had to gather courage to look down. The first great step came on January 23, 1960, when the bathyscaphe Trieste, a white steel sphere slung beneath yellow pontoons, carried two men, Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, 7 miles beneath the surface, into the Challenger Deep of the Mariana Trench. No human had ever gone so far into the ocean's black interior. The descent lasted nearly 5 hours. The water grew darker and heavier with every meter, until outside their tiny porthole there was nothing but a grainy haze. At 35,800 feet, they touched the silted floor and stirred a cloud that hung without direction, as if even gravity was reluctant here. They saw a flatfish-like creature glide away, living proof that even in the deepest silence, life persists. The steel sphere groaned, the bolts complained, and the weight of the Pacific pressed in with unimaginable force. Yet there was also stillness, a stillness that belonged to an older world. This dive was not just an act of engineering. It was a quiet visitation of a realm that has outlasted every empire and memory. The ocean floor where Picard and Walsh sat is as far removed from the bustling streets above as another planet. It is a place where sunlight has never touched and where creatures have invented entire ways of being without any need for eyes. Fossils and silt layers down there hold messages from long before humans learned to write ash from ancient volcanoes. Shells of creatures gone hundreds of millions of years. Chemical traces of climate shifts older than our species. Think, too, of the timelessness in those waters. The Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, they shift and trade currents, but the deep layers barely stir. Some of the cold water near the bottom of the Atlantic began its slow journey south before the first pyramids rose, before the caves at Lascaux were painted, before any map. It slides now past sleeping shipwrecks and forgotten mountains. In the Black Sea, ships lost to time sit intact in the anoxic dark. They would still whole after 1,000 years, because no oxygen remains to feed decay. Each wreck is a sudden pause in history, a story sealed and kept by salt and cold. If you close your eyes and try to feel the ocean as more than waves, you might sense this age in quiet. It is not truly silent. Whales sing in low notes that cross whole basins. Shrimp crackle in reef shallows, shifting sand whispers like breath, but to us it seems beyond sound. It is a place where beginnings echo still, where the first flicker of life remains in every cell, including your own. The salt in your blood matches the salt outside because your ancestors once floated there. Before your lungs knew air, your lineage knew the sea. To imagine the ocean is to remember that before we were born, and before our parents, and before our kind, life unfolded in darkness, with a patience we can hardly understand. The deep does not need us. It has kept its rhythms for ages, and will keep them long after. Yet it welcomed us once, long ago, and sent us ashore. In that sense, when we speak of before the first breath, we speak also of water, of silent, waiting oceans that dreamed us long before we dreamed ourselves. If you could step back before memory and before any map, you would find a world that feels at once strange and familiar, a landscape moving and breathing yet untouched by the idea of names. The ground itself would not be what you know. It would roll out in vast volcanic fields. Black rock cooled in twisting shapes after eruptions that once lit the horizon red for weeks at a time. Ash would drift across plains and settle into shallow valleys, softening edges that only fire had made. Rivers would cut their own paths through raw stone, foaming and fierce because no dam or bridge or human hand had yet tried to steer them. In the lowlands, water pooled and dried again as seasons shifted in ways we can no longer predict. The earth finding its own balance without fences or roads. Forests in this unpeopled world were thicker and stranger than any you can walk through today. Towering ferns, some higher than a man could see, uncurled toward light that broke through a heavy sky. Ancient conifers spread wide arms over damp floors carpeted with moss and spore-filled air. In those green shadows, creatures moved with patient weight. Mammoths trudged across clearings, their tusks curving like ivory moons, brushing bark and breaking branches with the sound of slow thunder. Saber-toothed cats crouched near waterholes, their long fangs catching small glints of light before they vanished back into dusk. These were animals sculpted by long ice and long hunger, built for a world that asked for resilience more than speed. Overhead, giant birds with wingspans wider than a man is tall drifted on quiet thermals, circling with sharp eyes that had never seen a spear or a fence. Evidence of these vanished ages still lies waiting where the ground kept it safe. In California, the La Brea tar pits bubbled gently under a sky crossed by freeways now. But for tens of thousands of years they were silent traps. The tar seeped up black and still, An animal would step in and find its legs heavy and held. A bison, a dire wolf, perhaps a mastodon would sink slowly, and the thick pitch would hold every bone in place. Today, paleontologists pull those bones from the dark with careful hands and brushes, counting tooth marks, measuring femurs, finding the quiet remains of entire vanished food chains. In Siberia, the tundra still gives back its frozen secrets when summer warms the ground. Whole mammoths appear with fur intact and eyes clouded but unbroken, so well kept by ice that even the grass from their last meal is still tucked in their mouths. These are messages from a world that ran its own course long before any story of us began. There were no cities then, no fields tilled in rows, no markers to say who belonged where. The land stretched unclaimed and unwitnessed. Rain fell and rivers swelled. Drought came and plants turned brittle. Winds carried seeds far beyond their birthplaces. Volcanoes altered climates in a single violent season. Glaciers pressed forward and ground down hills, then melted back and left new lakes behind. If you could stand there, alone but somehow not lonely, you would feel the pulse of something older and steadier than our quick histories. The ground did not yet answer to names or borders. It kept its own language of stone and fire and green. And yet even in that quiet, the first hints of us were stirring somewhere, small and almost invisible. A few clever primates in Africa had begun to knap stones into blades and scatter ash from campfires, but here in these great northern and western reaches, there were only tracks. At most you might find a single footprint hardened in volcanic mud, a print that would outlast its maker by tens of thousands of years. For the most part, it was a world running free of human thought. Self-ordered and immense, there is a certain peace in picturing this land before names. You can almost hear the wind sweeping unhindered across plains, smell damp earth after rain, feel the deep thrum of herds migrating across distances without fences. There is no clock. Time is measured in the growth rings of ancient trees, in layers of ash settling one after another. In the slow march of ice-carving valleys that will someday hold rivers and towns, the silence is not empty. It is filled with breath, with the rustle of fern fronds, with the distant calls of animals whose bones will one day sleep in tar or ice. To look back at this world is to see how temporary we are, and yet how connected. The calcium in our bones has moved through these same soils. The air we breathe carries echoes of those first forests. The mammoth and the saber-tooth are gone, but part of their world is still underfoot and undersea. We live atop a surface that remembers even when we do not. And before your first moment here, before the day someone whispered your name for the first time, this untamed earth had been shaping itself for you, not knowingly. Not for you in particular, but simply because it always has. It was building mountains and riverbeds, layering tar and ice, preparing the quiet ground on which your story would begin, deep within the earth, in chambers that have held their breath for tens of thousands of years. There are walls alive with color and quiet motion. If you could walk there with only a small flame in your hand, you would feel the air change first, cool and damp, filled with the scent of stone and time, and then, as the light wavered, you would see shapes lift from the darkness. Horses, bison, lions, and deer move across the rock as if they had been waiting for the right eyes to return. These places, Chauvet, in southern France, and Lascaux, not far away in the Dordogne, are among the oldest known galleries of the human spirit. Created long before we built cities, or wrote names, before we tamed fields or cast bronze. They belong to a time when survival was still a question each day, and yet someone paused, ground ochre and charcoal, painted a vision meant to last. The dates alone are hard to grasp. In the Chauvet cave, hidden behind sealed rock, until 1994, when Jean-Marie Chauvet and his companions chanced upon it. The paintings are more than 30,000 years old. They show running horses, woolly rhinoceroses, and prideful lions drawn with such grace that the muscles still seem to shift under the lines. At Lascaux, discovered by 4 boys and their dog in 1940, the main hall known as the Hall of the Bulls stretches with creatures almost life-sized, some overlapping, some filled with delicate dots and mysterious signs. These were made while Europe was locked in an ice age. While glaciers pressed down from the north and giant animals roamed a steppe. Yet in the flicker of torchlight, someone knelt close to stone and gave shape to their world. Imagine the moment, a small group entering the cavern, firelight trembling against dripping walls. They bring with them hollow bones for blowing pigment, handfuls of red and yellow ochre, black charcoal taken from ancient fires. They reach up with hands no different from ours and trace the curve of a bison's shoulder, the arch of a horse's neck. Some place their own palms flat and blow pigment over them, leaving behind ghostly signatures, negative hands. As if to say, I was here, though no one will know my name. These gestures came before writing, before recorded speech, yet they carry thought and feeling clear across millennia. In the pause between heartbeat and breath, a person reached out against forgetting. We know some of what they saw because the caves show it. Herds surging across open land. Antlers high, manes flying, predators circling. We know less of what they felt, but there is something unmistakable in the choice to mark, to transform stone into memory. It suggests an early ache to matter, to witness and be witnessed, even when life was short and uncertain. Perhaps they painted to teach, to show which animals to hunt, which to fear. Perhaps they painted for ceremony or calling, hoping the image might give power over the living creature. Or perhaps they painted simply to hold beauty still for a moment, to trap the swift and the wild where hands could reach. Some walls bear signs we cannot decode, grids, dots, strange forked marks. They might be the first maps, or tallies, or something closer to prayer. A set of dots beneath a bison might count the moon cycles until the herds returned. A grid might trace a journey across valleys, but it could also be something private and wordless. A language lost before it ever became letters. What is certain is the courage and patience of those first artists. They ventured deep into places without sunlight, carrying fire that might go out, trusting the stone to hold their visions. They mixed minerals and fat to make paint that would endure. They used curves in the rock to suggest movement and depth, understanding space before they had a word for perspective. And then they left, stepping back into the cold night, never to see how their work would outlive them by 30,000 years. It is hard not to feel humbled, standing before those images today. Scientists and explorers who first entered Chauvet spoke of a strange quiet, of time folding back until their own lives felt small. The torchlight still makes the animals seem to move. The hands still seem warm on the wall. In Lascaux, before it was closed to protect the fragile pigments, visitors often whispered without knowing why. The silence demanded it. Here were the first whispers of identity. Not kings or warriors, not monuments or empires, but a human saying, I have seen the world, and I want it to remember me. Even if you have never stepped into such a cave, the impulse they reveal is in you. We carve initials into wood, scratch hearts into sidewalks, take photographs, write diaries, save small things in boxes. We make marks against the tide of forgetting. Long before you were born, someone already feared being lost and answered by leaving an image. They could not know who would come after, or if anyone would. Yet they reached forward across time in a way that still touches you now. These caves remind us that we are not the first to wonder who we are or where we go. The same longing moved through hands smeared with ochre as moves through your own when you keep a letter or take a photograph. It is the desire to stay visible, even in absence. And perhaps in a way, those early marks are part of your before life too, not yours alone. But the shared human before, the slow building of memory into the world you entered. When you first drew breath, these walls already spoke for you, already kept a place for the idea of you. Long before you could know your name, someone was whispering to the dark, we were here, we mattered. Let it not be lost. Imagine the first cities rising out of mud and sunlight. Not yet called cities because no one had the word. Only clusters of lives gathering closer and closer until something new began to exist. Long before any of us arrived, long before your grandparents' grandparents could be imagined, there were places where strangers became neighbors, where fires burned in ordered rows, and where clay walls glowed red at dusk. One of the oldest was Kadal-Yuk in what is now southern Turkey, a settlement that thrived nearly 9,000 years ago. There were no streets there in the way we know streets. Houses pressed so tightly together that people walked across roofs instead, climbing down ladders into rooms filled with warmth and smoke. Inside, they painted their walls with red ochre bowls, hung horns as talismans, and buried their dead beneath packed earthen floors. Their lives folded into the places they lived so that each home carried its own quiet ancestry. Farther east, along the Tigris and Euphrates, a place called Ur grew in strength until its ziggurats rose like step-sided mountains over the flat floodplain. By around 2100 BCE, long before Homer dreamed of Troy or Rome was a rumor, Ur was a world unto itself. Traders led donkeys heavy with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, and wool from the river valleys, all converging where wide canals drew water from the Euphrates. Royal tombs there have yielded gold lyres, inlaid with lapis and shell, and the fragile remains of harps whose songs no longer sound, but whose forms still gleam in museum glass. Once those instruments accompanied processions and rituals under a desert sky, and the city buzzed with languages and markets, but time pulled its breath away. Ur became sand and ruin, and the wide streets where merchants haggled are now broken lines under the Iraqi sun across the Indus Valley. Rose, Mohenjo-daro, a marvel of order built 4,000 years ago. With streets set in perfect grids and houses fitted with indoor bathing areas and covered sewers, it would not be matched in complexity for centuries. There were wells in nearly every courtyard and wide boulevards where carts rolled with grain and pottery. The people there carved seals with animals, elephants, unicorn-like bulls, and a script that still defies full translation. Then, for reasons scholars still debate, perhaps shifting rivers, or slow drought, or the weight of disease, the city emptied. Its great bath, where water once gleamed under torchlight, is dry now. Its bricks, made too precise measurements, lie scattered among weeds. The silence there is complete, yet you can almost hear the echo of sandals on baked mud, of voices planning and dreaming in a language no one speaks. Far to the west, across oceans that no one then had crossed, another city quietly took shape. Caral, in the Soup Valley of Peru. Thriving more than 4,000 years ago, long before the Inca, before pottery even reached these shores. Here, on wide terraces above the river, people built pyramids and amphitheaters, wove cotton for fishing nets, played flutes made from pelican and condor bones. Caral was a city of music and ritual and clever engineering. Yet it fell into sleep so deep that for millennia the wind passed over its mounds without telling anyone there had once been songs. It was not until 1948, when archaeologist Ruth Shady and later others traced its forgotten footprint, that the city stirred again in memory. Everywhere on Earth there are these quiet proofs of lives once gathered and thriving. Pots rest shattered but whole enough to hold the thumbprint of the maker. Hearths hold ash from long-cooled fires. Streets are lined with stones rubbed smooth by feet that hurried to work or lingered in talk. Beneath modern cities lie other cities, sometimes layered 6 or 7 deep, each one once the center of its own universe. They fell for reasons large and small: flood, drought, invasion, neglect, but the falling was always the same. Breath stops. Noise fades, roofs collapse, and dust begins its long, patient work. Standing among these ruins, even in imagination, stretches the sense of time until it nearly breaks. You realize how brief each story is compared to the land that carries it. Cataluyuk's crowded rooftops once watched smoke curl from thousands of cooking fires. Now its mud bricks crumble quietly while the Anatolian wind sweeps past. Your ziggurat rises still, but only in broken tiers where soldiers once stood guard, and now only goats wander. Mohenjo-daro's wells are dry, its script unread, though somewhere someone's name must be hidden among those symbols. Caral's plazas hold no dancers, only dry grass and whispering reeds. Yet these places are not empty. They hold something more than silence. They hold proof that before you, before any trace of your story, there were hands making, minds planning, hearts hoping for permanence. They remind us that cities, like people, are experiments in staying. Each brick laid, Each street carved was once a declaration against forgetting. And still forgetting came, slow but unstoppable, until only shards remained. To walk mentally through these cities of dust is to understand that the ground beneath your own life is layered with many forgotten lives. It is humbling but also strangely comforting. For just as you step into a world built long before your birth, others will step into a world built on what you leave behind. The human wish to build and to be remembered is older than writing and older than memory. Older even than the names of these places. In their ruins, we see not only endings but a quiet, ongoing conversation between the living and the dead, one that began long before us and will continue long after. Long before temples rose in stone cities, and long before sacred texts were written or recited, people were already turning their eyes toward something larger than themselves, something unseen but deeply felt. The earth itself seemed alive and listening, the sky shifting with powers they could not name but wanted to honor. In the hills of southeastern Turkey stands one of the earliest and most haunting signs of this search, Göbekli Tepe. Its massive limestone pillars, some towering over 16 feet high and weighing several tons, were set upright by hands that had no wheels, no beasts of burden, and no metal tools, nearly 11,000 years ago. Each pillar is carved with animals, foxes, cranes, wild boars, serpents, cut with a precision that feels impossible for its age. This was not a village with homes. No hearths or trash pits tell of daily life. It was a place apart, built by gatherers and early herders who came together to shape a circle of stone in a world still new to farming. They gathered under open sky and raised these silent sentinels, perhaps to speak to spirits, perhaps to invite the invisible to draw nearer. Far to the west, across green hills and rolling fog, another circle would rise thousands of years later. Stonehenge. Its sarsen stones, dragged from miles away in bluestones, ferried somehow from the Preseli Hills of Wales, were arranged with extraordinary care, aligned with the solstices, so that light itself became part of the ritual. Imagine the effort. Whole communities cutting paths through forest and marsh, hauling stones each heavier than a car on sledges and ropes. By about 2500 BCE, those stones stood on Salisbury Plain, catching sunrise on the longest day and sunset on the shortest, turning the sky into a clock and a sign. Burial mounds nearby hold cremated remains older still, hinting that the dead gathered. Here too, resting near where the living looked for meaning. The earth was a stage, and humans were learning how to mark the thin space between life and whatever lay beyond. In Mesopotamia, where the rivers gave birth to cities like Ur, the conversation with death became more intricate. The Royal Cemetery of Ur, uncovered by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, revealed tombs that feel at once dazzling and tragic. Queen Pwabi's burial chamber, dated around 2600 BCE, was filled with gold headdresses, beaded cloaks, silver lyres, and lapis lazuli from faraway mountains, treasures meant to serve her beyond the grave. Outside her chamber lay the still and silent attendants who had drunk some fatal draught or suffered a blow to follow their ruler into death. Even at this early stage of civilization, humans believed so strongly in a continuing journey that they sent not only goods but entire retinues to accompany one who had passed. Life did not stop at the edge of breath. It simply changed rooms. These early monuments and burials share something striking: the effort to build, to carry weight, to carve and plan, even when survival was still fragile. People who hunted and foraged, who faced winters with no stored grain, spent precious strength to raise places for ceremony and remembrance. There is in this a deep recognition of our temporary nature and an almost defiant hope that connection can reach past the moment of dying. When we speak of religion or philosophy now, we inherit this older impulse to ask where we came from, where we go, and how to keep bonds unbroken. Death and birth have always been intertwined in these ancient works. Göbekli Tepe circles rise like ribs from the earth, at once a womb and a grave. Stonehenge marks cycles of the sun, linking the dying of winter to the return of light and crops and children. Ur's tombs bury lineage and wealth, but also seed new generations who would walk among their ancestors' mounds and feel protected, or warned, or remembered. To think about death is also to think about renewal. To bury is to plant a question and hope for an answer. Standing before these places today, you feel both distance and kinship. The air in Göbekli Tepe is dry and filled with the scent of time and dust. The carvings of vultures and lions remain sharp, though the builders' names are lost. Stonehenge. Modern visitors stand in quiet rings at dawn on the solstice, watching light pass through stones exactly as it did 5,000 years ago. Their cameras poor substitutes for the awe once felt. In the British Museum, Queen Pwabi's headdress glimmers under glass, gold and lapis, still shining as if the queen might lift her head again. Each site whispers the same thing. We have always tried to bridge the gap between what we can touch and what we can only imagine. Before you were born, before there were names for your family, or country, or faith, these questions were already alive. People long dead wrestled with the same unknown that waits for each of us. They believed there was something beyond night and breath, some passage where the living and the dead meet, where what begins must end, but perhaps not end entirely. They marked that hope with stone and gold and song. They aligned it to the turning of the sun. They built for it as if it were as real as any hearth or home. To remember this is to feel less alone in the face of mystery. The need to make sense of death and to hold on to life is ancient and shared. You arrive in a world already busy with that work, a world layered with sacred places older than cities and older than language. And perhaps this is part of the strange comfort in imagining what was before you, to know that even in the earliest dawn of our kind, humans were already standing on hillsides and under stars, speaking softly to the beyond, trying to weave life and death into one unbroken thread. Long before the idea of death became softened by modern customs and polished stone markers, it was faced with a kind of trembling wonder that led people to craft whole worlds for those who had stopped breathing but were not believed to be gone. The journey after life was imagined as long and full of obstacles, and the living felt a duty to help their dead move safely through it. All along the Nile, where the river itself seemed a slow and patient god, the Egyptians shaped perhaps the most complete vision of what lay beyond. To them, the soul would travel on a bark, a sacred boat that could slip between worlds. Tomb walls from as early as the Old Kingdom show these sleek vessels with high curling prows, crewed by spirits and gods. The dead, wrapped carefully in linen and placed within painted coffins, were given Shabti figurines to work on their behalf, amulets to guard the heart, and texts first spoken, later written in long rolls of papyrus to guide them past gates and guardians. The Book of the Dead, built up over centuries, is full of careful instructions. How to speak when your heart is weighed against the feather of Mat. How to convince Osiris that you deserve to walk in sunlight again. Far across oceans and jungles, the Maya pictured another road. They called the underworld Xibalba, a place of trials and tricksters hidden beneath the earth and water. In temple carvings at Palenque and Copan, kings are shown descending into the jaws of a great serpent, a passage into darkness that only those properly prepared could survive. Ceramics placed in graves showed journeys by canoe across black waters, rowed by death gods with skeletal faces. Some tombs deep under pyramids contained jade beads for wealth and bloodletting tools meant to nourish spirits along the way. The Popol Vuh, though written down long after Spanish conquest, remembers this ancient landscape of tests, houses of knives, of darkness, of jaguars, through which a soul must pass before reaching rebirth or rest. Death here was not an end, but an ordeal, a road to be survived with courage and ritual knowledge. To the Greeks, who built their cities along bright coasts and olive hills, the afterworld was shadowed but still mapped. They believed the dead gathered, first on the banks of the river Styx or Acheron, gray and silent, waiting for passage. To cross, they needed a coin, often an obol or danak, placed in the mouth or on the eyes at burial. Small payment to the ferryman Kuran, who would pole his dark skiff across the current. Without it, the soul was said to wander for 100 years. Homer wrote of this passage, and centuries later, Plato imagined the soul choosing new fates beyond its crossing. Graves across the Greek world bear witness to the belief, delicate gold foils, found folded with the dead, inscribed with directions. Say to Persephone that Bacchus himself has set you free. These were passports for the soul, prayers as maps. Archaeology keeps finding echoes of these beliefs in surprising places. In Mycenae, Greece, golden funerary masks hammered from thin sheets were laid over the faces of kings and warriors some 3,500 years ago. Eyes and mouths closed in eternal sleep yet shining still. In Egypt's Valley of the Kings, entire chambers bloom with color, stars on ceilings. Rivers of the next world winding past gods and protective spirits, hunting scenes where the dead might feast forever. In England, at Sutton Hoo, a great ship burial dating to the early 7th century was uncovered in 1939. Its timber long vanished, but its shape preserved in sandy earth. There lay a warrior's wealth, a pattern-welded sword, silver bowls, and a magnificent helmet now in the British Museum. All meant to sail the dead man into some distant realm of ancestors and power. Even in the cold Baltic and Scandinavian north, ship graves carried men and women out to sea, or buried them ashore as if about to depart. The Oseberg ship in Norway held 2 women amid carved sleighs, wagons, and woven tapestries, sailing them toward an unseen Valhalla. These journeys share a longing both simple and profound. Death frightened, but it did not erase the dead from the world of the living. Instead, it drew out care, gold laid gently on a brow, food tucked beside a wrapped body, songs whispered in the dark. The rituals were a way of saying, you still belong somewhere. You are still part of us, even as you go. The routes differed across sky or river, into serpent mouths or underground palaces, through sunlit fields of reeds or halls of mead, yet the feeling was shared. There is somewhere to go, and we can help you reach it. To think of this before your own first breath is to realize that the fear and hope around death are older than any name you carry. Long before your time, men and women stood at gravesides and riverbanks, lighting fires, scattering petals or sand, sending boats onto dark water, whispering words to help someone beloved find the path. They looked at lifeless faces and still dared to imagine a door beyond. That belief built pyramids and barrows, painted tombs and carved stones. It shaped the earliest art and story. It also made birth itself feel sacred, because to bring life forth was to stand at the same threshold and reverse it. To call someone back from the dark into breath and daylight. In every cradle and every grave, there is the same quiet mystery. It's the same turning of the wheel. When you were born, you entered a world already rich with these imagined maps. Though the rituals have changed, electric lights in cemeteries, polished granite markers, eulogies in soft rooms, the desire behind them remains. We still cannot stand at the edge of a life and accept silence alone. We reach back and forward, trying to make the unknown passable. The ancient barks, the golden masks, the ferrymen and serpent mouths, all remind us that humanity has been rehearsing for the journey as long as it has been human, trying with each death to promise the living that we are not lost but traveling on. There are places in the world where whole nations once moved and prayed and celebrated, where palaces rang with music and markets swelled with voices. And yet now the air carries only birds and wind and the patient sound of leaves returning to earth. Angkor in Cambodia was once a living capital larger than any city on earth in the 12th century. A complex of shining temples and royal roads stretched across more than 400 square miles. Waterworks cut like veins through the lowland forest canals, moats and reservoirs that turned flood and drought into harvest. At its heart rose Angkor Wat, a temple so vast and precise that even today its towers seem to float over the jungle canopy like a remembered dream. For centuries after the Khmer Empire fell in the 15th century, the city dissolved back into the forest. Roots twisted through sandstone, strangler, figs split walls, monkeys and birds took the places of priests. By the time Europeans arrived, only scattered Khmer villagers and wandering monks kept watch. And the world beyond had nearly forgotten a city that once ruled millions. To the south, on the African plateau, another power rose and fell, far from the trade routes known to medieval Europe. Great Zimbabwe grew between the 11th and 15th centuries, built from dry stone walls so high and wide that they still hold without mortar. The great enclosure, with walls curling like a granite serpent, sheltered kings and ceremonies of Ashona-speaking people who traded gold and ivory for Chinese porcelain and Arabian glass beads that archaeologists still find in the soil. But drought and shifting commerce, perhaps political fracture, brought decline. And by the time Portuguese chroniclers heard rumors in the 16th century, the city had emptied. Cattle grazed where drums once called warriors. Owls and bats claimed the stone towers. European explorers who reached the ruins in the 19th century refused to believe Africans could have built them, inventing wild tales of Phoenicians or the Queen of Sheba until excavations by archaeologists like David Randall McAveer and Gertrude Catan Thompson in the early 1900s finally restored the truth. The people of the plateau themselves built this stronghold and left. When their time ended in the jungles of Central America, Maya cities met a similar fate. For hundreds of years, kings ruled from limestone palaces at Tikal, Copan, Calakmul, and Palenque. Astronomers tracked Venus in eclipses with precision that still stuns. Scribes filled stones steely with glyphs recounting dynasties and wars. Plazas filled with dancers and markets. Yet by the 9th century, many great lowland cities declined. Their cause still debated: drought, war, exhausted soil, shifting alliances. Trees swallowed temples, vines bridged ball courts, jaguars stalked through palaces where scribes once worked. When Spanish conquistadors arrived centuries later, only scattered Maya towns remained, and the great carved histories lay silent under roots and moss. It was not until the 19th century, when explorers like John Lloyd Stevens and artist Frederick Catherwood hacked through jungle and mapped soaring pyramids, that the wider world learned again of these vanished capitals. Catherwood's drawings of temple stairs and hieroglyphs electrified Victorian readers. The lost cities seem like a dream, surfacing from the green ocean of forest. The pattern repeats in countless places. Petra's rock-cut tombs abandoned to sand and wind until Bedouin guides showed them to Europeans. Hampi's fallen temples in India glowing red at sunset but empty of their Vijayanagara rulers. Cahokia's great earthen mounds near the Mississippi, now silent fields where tens of thousands once gathered. Each tells the same quiet story that power and memory are fragile. That time waits until the walls crack and then carries on. Archaeologists often speak of rediscovery, but really, it is more like listening. The places do not sleep. They hold their own witness until someone notices. At Angkor, French naturalist Henry Mouat wrote with awe in 1860 about towers draped in banyan roots and carvings, sharp as if cut yesterday. At Great Zimbabwe, Catan Thompson's careful digs in 1929 sifted rumor from stone, feeling African craftsmanship denied for too long. At Tikal, jungle explorers in the 20th century, guided by local Maya knowledge, cleared vines and mapped pyramids higher than European cathedrals. Each expedition was less a conquering than a return to conversation with the past. Standing among these ruins, or even imagining them, stretches your sense of time until you feel the strange humility of arrival. Our lives appear short, our cities fragile. Every paved street and glass tower, will one day soften and crumble. One day roots will push through their floors, just as they did in Angkor and Tikal. Worlds bloom and fade with no promise of permanence. Yet, in that cycle, there is a kind of shared humanity. People built and loved and hoped here. They dreamed of lasting, and though their empires fell, their stones and stories reached forward across centuries to meet you. Before you were born, long before anyone thought of your birth, these empires had already lived their full arcs. They built in hope, thrived with art and trade, and fell into quiet, yet not into nothing. Their broken roads still hold the print of wheels and bare feet. Their temples still hold the smell of rain on carved stone. Their stories remind you that to exist is to join a long chain of beginnings and endings. To walk among their dust, even in imagination, is to know that the world you enter was not waiting empty. It was layered with cities and hearts that once believed, just as we believe now, that their moment might last forever. If you stand today on a field where war once raged, you might be surprised by how still it feels. How quietly the wind moves through grass that hides scars older than memory. The earth has a way of folding pain into itself, smoothing over trenches and craters until only a faint line of raised soil or an unexpected hollow remains. Yet beneath that quiet, the story is still there, layered deep and waiting. At Verdun, in northeastern France, where the Great War swallowed hundreds of thousands of lives between February and December of 1916, the forest now seems peaceful, its moss soft, and its paths dappled with filtered light. But the trees grow from ground saturated with metal and bone. The soil still exhales unexploded shells when rain and frost shift it. Farmers speak of the iron harvest, the endless surfacing of rusted helmets, twisted rifles, and live artillery shells a century after the guns fell silent. In ossuaries like Dalmont, beneath white stone and quiet corridors, the remains of at least 130,000 unknown soldiers lie mingled. A silent city beneath the surface, across the ocean. At Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the hills and ridges look gentle now, with summer grass waving and monuments of granite and bronze standing watch. But in July 1863, the air was choked with smoke and cries as Union and Confederate forces clashed for 3 terrible days, leaving more than 50,000 dead, wounded, or missing. Visitors walk today up Little Round Top or across the open field of Pickett's charge, often unaware of the countless bullets and mini-balls still buried, or the belt buckles and canteens found when new foundations are dug nearby. Letters, too, sometimes sealed in pockets and dropped in the chaos, have been discovered in the decades since paper browned and fragile, but words still visible. Names of wives and children reaching from that moment into ours. In the Soldiers' National Cemetery, where Lincoln came to speak in November of that same year, the silence is full. The speech he gave was short, but the ground had already spoken its longer story. On the beaches of Normandy, where Allied troops stormed the French coast on June 6, 1944, the sea now slides in and out with quiet rhythm, washing shells and driftwood ashore. The sand gives little sign of the fire and iron that once tore it apart. Yet divers along the coast still find helmets and rifles, landing craft wreckage, personal items marked with initials or serial numbers, carried by tides for decades. The American cemetery above Omaha Beach, with its thousands of white crosses and stars of David set in perfect rows, overlooks a coastline that once roared with engines and artillery, but now seems to breathe only wind and gulls. Each grave marks a person whose life was folded into the turning of history, their names etched so they would not vanish entirely. And yet many thousands more, German, American, British, Canadian, French, were never recovered, their bodies claimed by the sea or the soil. This is the dust of wars, ground mixed with memory and death. Soil forever changed by fire and blood. Time does not erase it. It only makes it quiet enough that new lives can walk there. Children play soccer over trenches in Flanders where men once drowned in mud. Tourists picnic on the slopes above Sebastopol and Gallipoli. Vineyards grow on land once shattered by shells. But as soon as someone digs deep for a cellar, a road, a tree, the past surfaces, rusted dog tags emerge, still legible with names and numbers. Medals and mess kits, spent cartridges, fragments of uniforms, pieces of bone come up through the plow. Each object is a small voice reminding that this ground was not always safe. Archaeologists and battlefield historians handle these things with care because they know they are not just artifacts, but remnants of breath. A dented helmet from Verdun may still hold the mud of 1916 and the initials of a boy who never returned. A soldier's compact pulled from a hedgerow in Normandy might still hold a photograph of a sweetheart folded behind cracked glass. Even the simplest things, a spoon, a penknife, a boot sole, testify to lives interrupted and to the strange persistence of matter when memory fades. Wars shape more than just landscapes. They alter how we inhabit the world after. Cities rebuilt over ruins carry scars in their maps. Roads following old trenches, parks over mass graves, memorials rising where command posts once stood. The quiet is not emptiness, but a truce with history. When you walk there, unknowingly or not, You walk among the aftermath of choices and fears, bravery and despair, of moments when entire futures were unmade. Before you were born, long before you took your first breath, the ground had already been turned and turned again by war. It bore witness to death on a scale beyond counting, then gathered itself back into silence so that life could return. Crops grew, birds nested, towns rebuilt. But beneath every calm field or smooth road lies this deep story. To feel it is to sense how fragile our peace is and how much has been paid for even. Out of ordinary days, the dust of wars is not just a phrase. It is real and still rising. It clings to boots in Verdun and Normandy, drifts across Gettysburg's meadows, and lingers in countless other places we have forgotten to remember. And it reminds us quietly but firmly that the world you enter has been made and remade through both creation and destruction. Each generation builds on land that once shook with thunder and grief, and yet still the grass grows and children laugh. The silence you hear now is not emptiness, but endurance. The earth's long act of healing after fire, long before there were maps or stories, or even the first painted hands on cave walls. There was ice moving with a patience so great it seems almost alive. Entire continents lay under white sheets thousands of feet thick, grinding across stone, reshaping hills into valleys and gouging deep lakes where no water had been. You can still see its work if you stand in places like Yosemite or the fjords of Norway or the long, snow-shaped valleys of the Alps. Granite once buried under miles of frozen weight now shows smooth and polished surfaces, striated with fine parallel cuts like signatures left by ancient glaciers. In North America, the last great ice age reached its peak around 20,000 years ago, and when it finally retreated, it left behind the Great Lakes, vast plains of fertile soil, and countless boulders dropped far from their home. Mountains, silent travelers abandoned when the ice melted. This cold world was not empty. Mammoths, with heavy coats and curved tusks, roamed the steppes of Siberia and Alaska, scraping snow to reach dry grass. Giant ground sloths lumbered across the Americas. Woolly rhinoceroses and musk oxen shared the wind-swept plains of Europe and Asia. These animals lived and died on the edges of glaciers that advanced and retreated over millennia, never knowing that their bodies would one day tell our story. When the cold finally loosened its hold, some of those creatures remained locked in permafrost, hidden time capsules. In Siberia, near the Kolyma and Lena rivers, local hunters and scientists sometimes stumble upon them still, a mammoth calf with ginger hair and milk tusks, a great bull with flesh and skin intact, even liquid blood preserved in frozen veins. When Luba, a baby mammoth perfectly preserved for 42,000 years, was found by a Nenets reindeer herder in 2007. Her tiny ears and eyelashes were still there, a glimpse of a vanished world that once breathed under a sun we would not recognize. For scientists, ice is more than scenery. It is an archive, pages stacked thin but unbroken, each year sealing the last beneath new snow. In Greenland and Antarctica, teams labor through endless days of drilling, coaxing slender cylinders of ice from depths that push past 2 miles. These cores, some longer than a man, hold a record of more than 100,000 years of weather and breath. Each trapped bubble of air is a tiny time machine, capturing the exact mixture of gases when it was formed, carbon dioxide rising and falling with warm ages and ice ages, volcanic ash settling after eruptions like Thera or Tambora, traces of pollen drifting from forests long vanished, the Greenland Ice Sheet Project, and later the North Greenland Eemian Ice Drilling Program, completed in 2012, have reached layers more than 128,000 years old, revealing interglacial warmth before the last ice age began. In Antarctica, the Epica Dome sea core stretches even further back, reading climate nearly 800,000 years into the past. To handle these cores is to hold time itself, layer after layer of snow that once fell silently while no one was alive to watch. What is striking is how clearly the ice remembers. Even what we might think of as small and passing. A violent storm blowing sand from the Sahara into Europe leaves a streak visible millennia later. An eruption in Iceland casts fine glass and sulfur that settles and locks itself into a single faint band. The Industrial Revolution left a thin gray marker of soot that future ages will read long after our names are gone. Each winter adds a page. Each summer seals it. No archive built by humans has proven so faithful or so long-lived. The ice also remembers life itself. Pollen grains trace the rise and fall of forests. Trapped DNA hints at past ecosystems, entire webs of plants and animals caught as if in an ancient photograph. Some scientists now even hope to recover ancient viruses and bacteria. Not to unleash them, but to understand how life once adapted to cold and change. In a strange way, ice is the planet's diary, honest and unedited. Carrying stories far older than writing, yet this vast memory is also fragile. Warming seas and air gnaw at glaciers. Permafrost that kept mammoths sealed for tens of thousands of years now thaws and releases, not just bones but methane and forgotten microbes. Ice cores risk melting before we can read them fully. The same archive that speaks so clearly of time can vanish within our own lifetime. Pages of history turning to water, to picture the world before you were born is, to imagine these cold movements shaping the ground that would one day hold you. Valleys where farms and towns now sit were cut by rivers of ice so heavy they sank the crust of the earth. Lakes that gleam blue in summer sun are footprints of vanished glaciers. The very soil that grows wheat and corn in broad plains was ground fine by ice, acting as a giant millstone. Even the air you breathe carries a quiet debt to the cold ages that once ruled. They set patterns of wind and ocean that still govern climate. There is something both humbling and strangely comforting in this. Long before humans stood tall or dreamed of gods, before we left handprints on caves or raised stone cities, the planet was already storing its own memory, keeping careful record in silence. The cold shaped us even before we existed, sculpting land, nurturing creatures whose remains would teach us about change and survival. And when you were born, the glaciers still stood watch in far places, holding within them storms and seasons that belonged to no one and yet to everyone. To walk today, where ice once reached, is to step across deep time. Fields seem ordinary, but they are built from ground carried hundreds of miles by glaciers. Mountains shaped like giant bowls or hanging valleys whisper of vanished tongues of ice. And somewhere deep beneath Greenland, a bubble of air waits, older than any story, carrying a breath from a world that did not know you, but somehow prepared a place for you, beneath the moving surface of the sea. There are places where whole stories rest intact, sealed by water and darkness, waiting in a stillness that feels almost holy. Ships, once alive with voices and footsteps, with lanterns swinging and kitchens clattering, now lie quietly on seabeds. Their decks carpeted with silt and slow-growing coral, their masts draped in nets of kelp. When a ship goes down, time stops in a way that land rarely allows. Cabins freeze in the exact state they were left. A chair tipped mid-fall, a coat still hanging on a hook, a doorway half-closed. The sea, with its strange combination of destruction and preservation, swallows yet protects. The most famous of these silent graves is the Titanic. Lost on the night of April 14, 1912, in the cold North Atlantic. She was called unsinkable, a floating palace of steel and brass, lit by electric lamps and warmed by hundreds of hands working deep in her engine rooms. More than 2,000 souls sailed on her maiden voyage from Southampton to Ward, New York. And yet, within hours of striking an iceberg, the great ship broke and slipped under, taking over 1,500 lives with her. For 73 years she lay unseen, nearly 4 kilometers down, in a place so dark and cold it seemed unreachable. When Robert Ballard and his team finally found her in 1985, guided by deep-sea cameras and sonar, the images they sent back stunned the world, the bow still proud. Railings intact, chandeliers swaying slightly in the current, shoes scattered across the mud. Each object was a whisper from April 1912, a teacup on its saucer, a child's boot. A sealed bottle with its cork still tight, fragments of futures cut short yet, somehow still present, But the Titanic is only one voice in an oceanic choir of lost vessels. The Black Sea, because its deeper waters lack oxygen, holds some of the best preserved wrecks on Earth. There, beyond the reach of light and decay, Byzantine merchant ships, with intact masts and cargo still in place, sleep on the bottom, as if their crews might climb back aboard at any moment. In 2018, a Greek trading vessel over 2,000 years old was found more than a mile down. Its shape unmistakable, a long, slender hull with rising stern and mast, perfectly preserved after millennia in darkness. Amphorae for wine and oil rest where sailors left them when storms or war or miscalculation brought the ship to its end. These finds are like time machines. They let us see details of daily life, not through fragments but through entire spaces suspended as they were. The 20th century left its own share of drown time. World War submarines, both German U-boats and Allied craft, scatter the Atlantic and Pacific. Some are shallow enough that divers can approach. Others rest too deep, visited only by robots and remote cameras. Inside, there are still logbooks, cooking pans, wrenches on benches, boots lined neatly where crewmen last stood. Each vessel is at once a machine and a tomb, and those who enter speak of a hush that goes beyond ordinary fear. In the waters off North Carolina, the wreck of U-352 is now a reef covered in fish and soft coral. But divers who swim through her steel ribs know men once fought and died inside those walls. In the Channel, British submarines like HMS Afraid sleep where they fell. Every valve and gauge unmoved since the moment sea poured in. Explorers who visit these places talk often of the strange feeling that arrives when they cross the threshold. From open water into the human space of a wreck. Outside, there is only blue and black and the slow drift of particles. Inside, there is geometry, furniture, stairs, railings, even the suggestion of breath. Light from their torches catches brass instruments still shining, names engraved on bells, a clock frozen at the moment power failed. They know they are trespassing in rooms that belong to lives interrupted. It is not a horror, but a deep sadness, quiet awe, at how quickly ordinary life can end, and yet how faithfully the sea remembers it. Sometimes the discoveries are intimate enough to stop speech. In 2014, deep divers found a pair of leather boots in the Titanic's debris field, arranged as if someone had once been standing there. In the Black Sea, a table still holds bowls where sailors might have been eating their last meal. Off Scapa Flow in Scotland, where the German High Seas Fleet scuttled itself in 1919. Whole warships rest upright, telegraphs and capstans untouched, their silence heavier than any graveyard. Each scene is a locked room where the clock never resumed. Before you were born. Oceans had already filled with these moments of frozen time. Wars, storms, accidents, each one ended suddenly, yet the story did not vanish. The water kept it layer by layer, sealing wood and iron and flesh inside cold secrecy. Now we arrive with cameras and lights, strangers peering in, learning not just about technology and trade, but about hope and fear and endings. A shipwreck is both a catastrophe and a monument. It turns tragedy into a message that crosses decades or centuries. To think of this is to understand how much of the past still waits beneath the surface. It's untouched but not gone. The sea hides, but also preserves. It takes, but does not always destroy. And in that deep, enduring quiet, there is a reminder. The world keeps memory even when we forget. The next diver to shine a beam into a stateroom or over a deck may see the exact chair a passenger touched, the very tools a sailor laid down. In these drowned rooms, time has not moved forward. It waits, patient and cold, for someone to notice the oceans were here before your birth, before your line existed. And they have been collecting these fragments of human story since the first boat dared to leave shore. They will go on long after, holding both the grandeur and the frailty of all our journeys. Each wreck a testament to lives once full of motion, laughter, and breath, now resting quietly in blue shadow. When you look at the night sky, you are really looking into the past. Because light takes time to travel, and the farther a star or a galaxy lies from us, the older the light that reaches our eyes, Some of the faintest light of all is not tied to any star, not even to any galaxy, but to the very beginning of everything. Scientists call it the cosmic microwave background, a soft glow of radiation that fills all of space. Left behind like the cooling embers of the Big Bang that gave birth to the universe nearly 13.8 billion years ago. It is not visible to the naked eye, not something you can see as a line or a shape, but rather a thin wash of energy that exists everywhere, passing through you even as you sit and breathe. It is a whisper from a time when there were no stars, no planets, not even atoms as we know them. Only a dense, hot fireball expanding and cooling until matter could begin to form. For most of human history, no one could have known this faint signal was out there, much less that it was the universe's first message. People saw the stars as gods or fires or holes in a great dome, and they made myths to explain their twinkling. Even scientists well into the 20th century debated whether the universe had a definite beginning or had simply always existed. Some favored the so-called steady-state theory, which suggested that matter constantly formed to fill the gaps as galaxies drifted apart. Others proposed a singular, explosive birth, an idea that sounded almost like philosophy until evidence began to mount. The key moment came not in some vast observatory, but in a field in New Jersey in 1964, when two radio astronomers, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson, were working with a large horn-shaped antenna at Bell Labs. Their project was not to study the origins of the cosmos, but to test radio signals for communications satellites. Yet they kept encountering a background noise that would not go away, no matter how they adjusted their equipment. The noise came from every direction at once, constant and faint, like a hiss that never faded. They thought at first it must be interference from the city, or even from pigeons nesting inside the antenna. They cleaned out the birds and their droppings, polished the equipment, recalibrated everything, but the signal remained. It had a temperature of just a few degrees above absolute zero, and it was everywhere. At the same time, a group of physicists at Princeton, only 30 miles away, had been trying to detect exactly such a signal. They had predicted that if the universe truly began in a hot, dense state, the leftover heat should still be glowing, stretched out by billions of years of expansion into microwaves. When Penzias and Wilson compared notes with the Princeton team, the realization came quickly. What they had stumbled upon was the afterglow of creation itself, the cosmic background radiation. For this discovery, they would later be awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1978. But more than that, their accidental finding tipped the balance of science firmly toward the Big Bang theory. The universe had a beginning. It had left behind a trace that could still be heard since then. Satellites and telescopes have mapped this faint radiation with ever greater precision. In the 1990s, the COBE satellite showed tiny ripples in the glow, slight temperature variations that represented the seeds of galaxies, the faint fingerprints of gravity beginning to pull matter into clumps. Later, the WMAP mission and then the Planck satellite produced maps of astonishing detail, showing the infant universe when it was only 380,000 years old, a kind of cosmic baby picture. In those maps, the entire sky glows a mottled pattern of blues and reds, each color shift representing a fraction of a degree difference in temperature. Each speck a place where billions of years later, galaxies would rise. What is remarkable is that this signal is not confined to the edge of the universe or to some distant corner, but is present everywhere. Every patch of sky, no matter how empty it seems, carries the same echo. When you tune a television to an unused channel and see static, a tiny fraction of that snow is this radiation. Billions of years old, brushing your senses without your knowing, you are surrounded by the memory of the universe's birth at every moment. Even in the silence of your own room, to think of this is to realize that before you were born, long before your family or your species, even before stars like the sun began to shine, there was already a kind of light filling all of space. It is older than any cave painting, older than the first cell to breathe oxygen, older even than the Earth itself. It is the universe remembering its own beginning, holding on to a trace of the heat and energy from which everything else emerged. You are, in a way, made of that memory, because without the Big Bang and its lingering glow, there would be no galaxies. Number stars, no heavy elements forged in stellar cores, and no bodies to carry breath. When Penzias and Wilson first heard that hiss in their antenna, they did not know at once what they were touching. Yet what they had brushed against was the oldest signal that can be touched at all, the farthest reach back in time that science can yet detect. It is humbling to know that, while our lives are brief and fragile, we move inside a cosmos that remembers its first instant and carries that memory everywhere. The quiet static between stations, the faint microwave energy in every direction, is the ghost of a beginning that still surrounds you. A reminder that you live in a universe whose first word has never quite stopped echoing. When you step outside on a clear night and look up, the sheer number of stars can feel almost unbearable. There are so many, scattered across blackness. Each one a sun with its own possible worlds circling it, some small and rocky like ours, some larger and stranger, but all bathed in light that could nurture life. Modern astronomy has confirmed what ancient dreamers guessed. Planets are not rare. The Milky Way alone may hold billions of them in zones where liquid water can exist. And beyond our galaxy stretch countless more. Yet despite this staggering abundance, despite decades of scanning the heavens for signals, there is no sign that anyone has ever come to visit or even called to say they are there. This puzzle is known as the Fermi paradox, named after the physicist Enrico Fermi, who once asked during a casual lunch in 1950, "Where is everybody?" It is a question that still hangs over us like a quiet echo, heavy with possibility. Scientists have offered many answers. Perhaps life is rare after all, a fragile accident that seldom survives long enough to build radio telescopes or starships. Perhaps civilizations grow and burn out before they can reach across the stars, their signals dying with them. Some suggest intelligent life may avoid broadcasting or traveling, fearful of predators or simply uninterested in reaching beyond. Others wonder if we are deaf to what is being said, listening on the wrong frequencies or with the wrong kind of ears. And it may be that the distances are simply too vast, the light years too wide, so that even if there are voices, they will not reach us for millions of years. Long after we are gone, in the face of that silence, humans have tried not just to listen, but to speak. In 1977, NASA launched two small spacecraft, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, on missions to explore the outer planets and then slip free of the solar system entirely. Each carries a golden record, a phonograph disc of copper plated in gold, meant as a message to anyone or anything that might someday find it. The records hold 115 images encoded in analog form, greetings in 55 languages. The sounds of wind and surf and thunder, whale songs, footsteps, and a baby crying. There is music too. Bach, Beethoven, Blind Willie Johnson's Dark Was the Night, Cold Was the Ground, and a Navajo night chant, along with a heartbeat and laughter. On the cover are instructions for playing it and a map showing the position of our sun among nearby pulsars. A cosmic return address etched into metal. Carl Sagan, who helped lead the project, called the record a bottle cast into the cosmic ocean, a gesture of hope rather than certainty. Voyager 1 has now traveled farther than any human-made object, over 14 billion miles from Earth. Beyond the heliosphere, where the sun's influence wanes and true interstellar space begins, it moves at more than 38,000 miles per hour. Yet even so, it will take tens of thousands of years to pass near another star, and perhaps millions before anyone could plausibly find it. But that is not the point. The point is that we tried to answer the silence with a whisper of our own. To say that on one small blue planet there were beings who listened and wondered and sang, other messages have gone out too. In 1974, the Arecibo Observatory sent a brief radio transmission toward the globular cluster M13, 25,000 light-years away, a binary-coded portrait of DNA, humans, and our solar system. It will take that signal 25 millennia to arrive. If anything replies, it will not reach us for another 25 millennia after that. We have also sent signals piggybacking on ordinary television and radio broadcasts, leaking into space since the first transmitters crackled to life. By now, our earliest shows and speeches have traveled more than 100 light-years. forming a faint, expanding sphere of human noise that grows every second. Carrying Hitler's 1936 Olympics address and the Beatles on Ed Sullivan into star fields that do not know us yet so far, nothing answers. The silence deepens each year, both unsettling and strangely beautiful. It reminds us of our fragility, but also our courage. Even in the face of an indifferent cosmos, we still reach out, still tell our story. And the paradox itself is a kind of mirror. It forces us to look at what survival means. If civilizations often end before they can cross the stars, then ours must learn how not to end. If danger lurks in the dark, then we must decide how to balance curiosity and caution. If the silence is only an illusion born of time and distance, then we are listening to a choir whose first notes have not yet reached us. There is another way to think about it, though no voice has reached us. Our voices are already leaving. Long after you and everyone you know are gone, long after our languages evolve beyond recognition or vanish entirely, the voyagers will still be moving outward. Their gold records may remain readable for 1 billion years, drifting in cold, dark space, each atom whispering we were here. Our radio and television waves will keep expanding too, thinning but persisting, a ghostly bubble of human presence. Somewhere, countless ages from now, some patient intelligence might stumble on them and know that once. Far away, there were beings who loved and fought and learned, who tried to map the sky and sing into it. Before you were born, this effort was already underway, as if we could not stand the thought of being alone. The great silence does not mean nothing exists. It means we have not yet crossed paths. In the meantime, we keep building dishes that stare at stars. We keep sending out small messengers. We keep engraving our brief lives into signals and objects and hoping they will outlive us. There is dignity in that, a kind of quiet defiance. We may be a flicker in cosmic time, but we refuse to pass without leaving a trace. And perhaps that is enough for now. To know that we are part of a universe vast beyond measure, listening into stillness and daring to answer. Somewhere far beyond the reach of memory, our words are still traveling outward. And in that endless night, the first whispers of who we were are just beginning their long journey. There is a question that seems simple, but never really ends. Where were you before you were? Not just before birth in the sense of a mother's body or a family waiting, but before that, before the spark that became you, before any thread of memory. Ancient thinkers worried at this mystery long before there were telescopes or modern science. The Greek philosopher Epicurus said, "Death is nothing to us because we did not exist before we were born and felt no pain. We will return to that same state after." Aristotle, pondering the soul, wrote about potentiality, about how something can be present as possibility long before it comes into form. Buddhist texts speak of an endless wheel of birth and death, suggesting you were not nowhere, but moving through patterns without a single fixed identity. Slipping in and out of being like a dreamer, moving between dreams. To imagine this non-existence is unsettling at first because the mind is built to picture things, and nothing cannot be pictured. We are accustomed to imagining darkness, but darkness is still something. It is an image you can hold. Yet the time before you is not darkness, not sleep, not space. It is simply the absence of self. Some teachers have reached for metaphors to help. Perhaps it is like the pause between breaths, like the blank page before words arrive, or the deep, unmeasured sleep from which you wake with no sense of time passing. The Upanishads, some of the oldest Indian philosophical writings, say that before birth and after death, the self returns to a kind of unbound knowing, like water poured back into the sea. In Zen stories, teachers sometimes ask students to remember the face they had before their parents were born. Not because one can answer, but because the question itself cracks the shell of ordinary thought. You can feel that strangeness if you try to look backward beyond memory. At first you find childhood soft and bright or dim and incomplete, then the blank where memory fails, yet still your body was alive then. Push further and you reach a point where even the body was not here. There is no corner to turn, no door to open, only the realization that time flowed on without you, and then, one day you joined it. It is a little like stepping into a river. The water was moving long before. but to you it seems to begin the moment you enter. This puzzle touches on something deep in human longing, the wish to know. If life is only this brief window or part of a larger field, some ancient Greeks imagined the soul as a traveler drinking from the river Lethe before rebirth, forgetting past lives to start again clean. Plato's dialogue Menos suggests learning may be remembering knowledge from before birth, a dim echo of something the soul already knew. Buddhist and Hindu thought suggest a wheel of samsara, endless becoming and unbecoming, until one can step off the wheel into liberation. Meanwhile, materialist philosophers have said simply that you came from nothing and will return there, and that this is neither tragic nor comforting but simply true. Yet even strict materialism cannot quite silence the intuitive curiosity. We know that before we arrived, the world was full and busy, stars burning, cities rising and falling, people making love and war, glaciers moving, but we cannot feel it because there was no we to feel. Still, the ingredients of you existed. The calcium in your bones was already folded into stone and seashells. The carbon of your cells drifted through ancient trees and breathed out by animals long extinct. The iron in your blood forged billions of years ago in the heart of stars. So you were not present, but you were also not nowhere. You were matter and potential, waiting to be gathered. Perhaps this is why so many cultures picture pre-life not as void, but as something gentle and timeless. Some liken it to being dreamed. Others to the interval of dawn before light touches anything, when everything is there but hidden. There is even a modern scientific echo of this, the idea that before conception, your genetic material was moving through time, carried forward silently, half of you once inside your mother before she was even born. Because a girl's eggs begin forming while she is still a fetus, half of you and your father, cells dividing and waiting. The chain reaches back unbroken through millions of years, through countless other creatures who lived and died, without knowing they were carrying seeds of you. When you follow this thread long enough, metaphysical curiosity begins to bloom almost on its own. What does it mean that the self seems so solid yet emerges from such vast anonymity? Is the I we guard so carefully just a brief eddy in a river that keeps flowing, a pattern borrowed for a moment before returning? Or is there something that travels through all the changes, not personality, not memory, but some quiet principle of awareness? These questions have no final answer, and yet they matter, because they shape how we live now. If we came from nothing and returned to nothing, perhaps we love harder, knowing time is short. If we came from something larger and returned to it, perhaps we can meet fear with a kind of trust. Before you were born, the universe held you only as possibility, and yet that possibility was enough. The night sky, the mountains, the cells dividing unseen, all of it prepared a place. And so when you wonder where you were really touching the edge of mystery that every human before you has felt. The vast, silent before that somehow became a life, and the hint that after we are gone, something of us may slip back into that same quiet, waiting to be dreamt again, or simply resting in a peace beyond imagining. There is a thin and shifting place, where life seems to loosen its hold. And though most who visit it cannot stay, they return with stories that feel both deeply personal and strangely shared. Doctors call these accounts near-death experiences. And while the details vary, a remarkable pattern appears again and again. Someone suffers a cardiac arrest, or loses blood pressure in surgery, or after an accident. The body goes still. The monitors fall silent. And yet consciousness does not seem to stop in the way we expect. Many describe rising up and looking down, seeing their own body from a place above, the room unfolding with cool clarity. Others speak of being pulled through a tunnel toward an encompassing light, not blinding but gentle, filled with a feeling beyond language, peace, welcome, love. Some meet relatives long dead, or hear music without instruments, or sense a boundary, a kind of edge beyond which they know they cannot pass if they wish to return. These reports go back further than modern medicine. Plato tells of a soldier thought dead on the battlefield around 400 BCE who awoke during his funeral and recounted a journey beyond, where souls were judged and chose new lives. Medieval visionaries wrote of radiant gardens or terrifying chasms glimpsed while suspended between breath and nothingness. But it was in the late 20th century that systematic study began. In 1975, the physician Raymond Moody published Life After Life, collecting cases that shared striking motifs: the tunnel, the light, life review, the feeling of detachment from pain and fear. Since then, cardiologists, neurologists, and psychologists have gathered thousands of similar accounts from patients whose hearts stopped for minutes yet who returned able to recount vivid scenes that took place while they were clinically dead. Science has tried to trace these experiences back to the body. When the heart stops, blood no longer feeds the brain, and within seconds, the cortex begins to fail. Lack of oxygen, or hypoxia, can cause sensations of floating bright lights. And profound calm pilots pulling extreme G-forces have reported similar tunnels and euphoria just before blacking out. Neurochemistry may also play a role. Some researchers suspect a surge of neurotransmitters such as endorphins and the release of DMT, a naturally occurring hallucinogen found in trace amounts in humans, might flood the dying brain and generate intense imagery. Studies using EEG have found that in the seconds after cardiac arrest, before true flatline, there can be a spike of organized gamma activity, fast waves often linked to memory and perception, as if the brain in its final burst is writing a last, extraordinary page. Yet these physiological theories do not settle everything. People under deep anesthesia, with no measurable cortical activity, have still reported complex scenes in verifiable details. Describing surgical instruments or conversations later confirmed by staff, others recount meeting deceased family they did not know had died until after recovery. Skeptics say memory can be constructed, and perception under trauma is unreliable. Advocates reply that some cases resist simple dismissal. For now, the border remains dim. What is clear is the effect on those who come back. Many survivors of near-death episodes report lasting changes: a softened fear of dying, greater patience with daily life, a hunger for connection and kindness. Soldiers, accident victims, and surgical patients have returned not with certainty about heaven or reincarnation, but with a quiet conviction that consciousness is more resilient than they imagined. Some stop chasing status or wealth. Some reconcile with a strange family. Some devote themselves to helping others. Whatever happened in those seconds or minutes, it felt real enough to rearrange what matters. Hospitals have begun to take note. Studies like the AWARE Project, launched in 2008 by Dr. Sam Parnea, have tried to catch these moments as they happen, placing hidden images in operating rooms to test if patients can report seeing what should be invisible. Results so far are limited but intriguing. With a few verified perceptions from people whose brains were, by standard measures, offline, researchers remain cautious, unwilling to claim proof of life beyond death, but equally unwilling to ignore testimony that is consistent and transformative, perhaps. The deepest truth near-death experiences offer is humility. The machinery of the brain can explain much, the flooding of chemicals, the last bursts of energy, but not the full depth of these reports. It's not the way they echo across cultures and centuries. And yet to leap from that mystery to certainty about what lies beyond is also unwarranted. What we can say is that at the edges of life, perception becomes strange. The usual boundary between self and nothing blurs. Those who have been there return speaking of vastness, of love, of seeing their lives whole as if from far above. But they also admit that words fail and understanding slips away the moment breath returns. Before you were born, and long before science had names for any of this, people already wondered what it means to die, and perhaps to return. They told stories to comfort and to warn. Now we have monitors and data, but the question remains. The near-death horizon is not an answer so much as a hint, a place where the known ends and something larger touches briefly into view. For most of us, it is enough to know that others have stood there and come back changed, that the passage into nothingness may not be as sudden or empty as we fear. It may be that death is only silence, a falling back into the same before from which we came. It may also be that mind is wider than we can measure, flickering beyond the reach of instruments for a moment longer than we expect. Either way, the accounts form a gentle bridge between curiosity and comfort. They remind us that while life is brief and fragile, the act of living is connected to something deep and strange, something that can carry a glimpse of wonder even at its last breath. There is a quiet thought that slips in. When you stare long enough at the idea of beginnings and endings, a thought older than any single culture and still alive in modern science, what if time is not a straight road at all, but something that bends back on itself? Circle we keep walking without knowing. Many of the earliest civilizations, watching the sun rise and set and the seasons return, sensed that life did not simply move forward, but repeated. In India, philosophers of the Vedic and later Hindu tradition imagined vast cycles called kalpas, immense ages during which the universe is born, spans, decays, and is dissolved only to arise again. A single kalpa, they said, lasts 4.32 billion years, and countless kalpas have passed already. The god Vishnu sleeps and dreams worlds into being, and when he stirs, universes end and begin again. A breathing far larger than any one life, or even one cosmos. Greek thinkers came to similar pictures, though they spoke with different names. The Stoics believed in the eternal return. The universe itself periodically burns in a great fire, like pyrosis, and is remade, with everything and everyone recurring exactly as before. To them, your life and mine and all histories might be lived again an infinite number of times, each with the same choices and same outcomes, as inevitable as the turning of constellations overhead. Later philosophers took up the idea not as literal fate, but as a test. Nietzsche asked whether you would live your life joyfully if you had to repeat it endlessly. A question meant to weigh meaning and acceptance. Across the ocean, the Maya built their calendars on wheels within wheels. The 260-day ritual cycle and the 365-day solar year interlocking like gears, creating great counts that stretch thousands of years. They did not picture time as a blank march into nowhere, but as turning seasons of creation and destruction. The completion of a Bacton, roughly 394 years, marked endings and renewals, not annihilation, but the turning of one grand page to another. When the long count rolled over in 2012, popular culture feared apocalypse. But to the Maya, it was simply the start of a new cycle. Even the physical world suggests repetition. The earth spins and circles the sun. The moon pulls tides and returns to the same phase. Comets sweep back after long absences. Glaciers advance and retreat. Species rise and vanish, and new ones echo their shapes. We are used to thinking of our lives as linear, yet every breath is part of a loop. Inhale, exhale, sleeping and waking. Birth, following death as surely as day follows night, modern cosmology. It's built not on myth, but on equations, has also found itself circling back to circles. The Big Bang still seems the best description of our universe's beginning. But there is debate about what came before that fiery expansion. Some physicists propose a big bounce, where the cosmos expands, slows, collapses, and explodes anew, endlessly recycling. Others consider quantum models where time itself is not fundamental, but emerges, where a previous universe's death seeded ours. Cyclic universes were suggested by Richard Tolman in the 1930s, and have reappeared in new guises with string theory and loop quantum gravity. None of these ideas is proven, but they echo the old intuitions. Perhaps what we call before and after are just different. Reaches of the same endless movement, even black holes, once thought of as final ends, now seem to connect to new beginnings. Some theorists imagine the core of a black hole might birth a new expanding region of space-time, invisible to us, but as real as our own. The thought is dizzying. Our universe itself could be the inside of some other collapsed star, and what we see as our future collapse could ignite new worlds. For an individual life, this notion is both impossible and strangely comforting. If time is circular on some deep level, then the before you came from and the after you fear may not be separate. Just as rivers loop back to the sea and rain returns them to mountain springs, What ends might also begin again, not in a sentimental promise, but as part of the way reality breathes. Even the atoms in your body are living proof. They have cycled through stars and seas and stones countless times. Each death of a star, a birth of heavier elements that later joined to form your bones and blood. Ancient festivals marked his intuition long before any science tried to describe it. The Hindu festival of Mahashivaratri celebrates destruction and renewal, the wheel turning. Roman New Year rites and harvest festivals whispered the same. Nothing is lost. It comes back. The Celts lit fires on Samhain to mark a year's death and invite the next. Even now, our calendars are rings. Each December, we stand at an end that is also a beginning. To think of time this way does not solve the fear of death, nor does it guarantee that the self you know will return. But it changes the texture of the unknown. The linear story says there is a sharp break, of vanishing. The circular story says you have always been part of something that remakes itself. That before you were born and after you die may be made of the same quiet fabric. The Greeks called it palingenesis, the Hindus samsara, the Maya simply turning time. Physics calls it recurrence, or bounce, but underneath the names is the same wonder. The universe may not be a single arrow, but a tide. When you were born, it was into a world already old with cycles, seasons, stars, and perhaps whole universes rising and falling before you. To imagine time as a circle is to feel less like an interruption and more like a moment in an immense rhythm. You do not begin from nothing and vanish into nothing. You arise where other things have ended and will someday feed beginnings you will never see. Before and after blur into the same river flowing forever, carrying us all for a little while and then carrying on. The first sound you ever made was not a word but a cry, and before that moment there was only fluid and heartbeat. A slow, rocking darkness filled with muffled echoes of the world you had not yet met. For months you floated in a private ocean, warm and close, your ears catching only the blurred rhythm of your mother's blood and the low rumble of voices from outside. Then suddenly, in a rush of pressure and light, you were forced out into air. Your skin, once protected by water, felt cold for the first time. Your lungs, which had never unfolded, burned and filled and found their voice. That single gasp was a doorway. On one side, silence and suspension. On the other, breath and time and everything that would follow. Though none of us remember it, we were all travelers once. Leaving a world we could not name for another we did not know. Birth is not gentle from the body's view. The change in light alone is staggering before. Only red shadows and dim pulses, then a sudden white brilliance. Before, water pressed evenly on every side, weightless and safe. Then hands and air and gravity claimed you. Even your senses reorganized, smell and taste, almost dormant, awoke. Sound sharpened from dull thumps to sharp edges of words and clatter. Sight slowly unblurred into color. Yet somehow you survived that shift and called it the beginning, perhaps. This is why so many have wondered if death might be the same journey in reverse. The poets have guessed it for centuries, but so have those who have come close to dying. Where birth forced breath into you, death seems to let it go. Where birth flung you into light, death might return you to a warm and fathomless quiet. In that sense, the first cry and the last breath are not opposites, but mirror acts. One pulls you in, one releases you back. People who have walked near the edge sometimes describe dying as a surprising return. Mountaineers caught in avalanches and revived speak of slipping into deep calm as the world faded. Not panic, but relief, like going back to something long forgotten. Astronauts, too, though alive and safe, have said that crossing into space brought a strange homecoming rather than alienation. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin stepped onto the lunar surface in 1969, their words were measured for history, but later, in quiet interviews, they spoke of a sense that the boundary between here and there was thin and gentle. As if stepping outside the cradle of Earth was also stepping closer to some original place. Edgar Mitchell, another moonwalker, said he felt an overwhelming sense of universal connectedness, looking back at the blue marble of home. A peace he could not name but that followed him back to Earth and into the rest of his life. Sailors. who cross the great oceans often speak the same way after storms. A feeling carried and cradled by something vast and patient. Polar explorers, after months of isolation, describe strange dreams of warmth and reunion as frostbite and exhaustion close in. These are not proofs of anything beyond life, but they hint at an old memory embedded deep, as if the body knows how to let go when its time is finished. Just as it once knew how to arrive, though, we do not remember learning. Medical staff who attend births and deaths sometimes remark on the resemblance to. They see the same fierce focus of the body, the same deep instinctive sequence of actions that no mind commands. In delivery rooms, the baby must fight and surrender at once. In quiet hospice rooms, the dying person's breathing slows and patterns itself. A last work of transition that belongs more to nature than to thought. Nurses sometimes say the room grows strangely still and clear just before the final breath. Not frightening, but solemn and peaceful, like tide turning. None of this turns death into something simple. It remains mystery and loss. But thinking of it as a return softens the edges. Just as birth was not an end of safety, but the start of new experience, perhaps death is not annihilation, but a shift into what held you before you were. In the moments just after birth, doctors say babies often grow quiet once more, if held close and warm. The shock fades, and a deep trust in calm comes back. If there is any symmetry, the last breath might bring that same calm, a surrender into whatever waits. Long before you were born, people were already making sense of these thresholds. They told stories of souls carried across rivers, of being welcomed by ancestors, of light and song and peaceful meadows. Today we have monitors and medicine, but the mystery is not smaller. The explorers, the astronauts, climbers who have touched near death, still reach for the same simple words. Coming home, going back, no fear. They do not all agree on what they saw or felt, but the tone is striking relief, connection. Release to hold these thoughts is not to claim certainty about what lies beyond life, but to honor the deep rhythm that began with your first cry and will end one day with a breath just as elemental. You began by leaving a world of water and darkness you could not remember. You may end by returning to a quiet that feels familiar, though you cannot name it. The long story of the cosmos, the generations before you, even the deep ocean you once floated within, all suggest that movement. In, out, in, out. Birth, death, arrival, return. Knowing this does not cancel grief or fear, but it adds a thread of kinship to the unknown. You have already crossed one impossible boundary and lived. The first cry tore you from silence and began your time here. The last breath may simply close the circle and carry you, gently, to whatever held you before there were names. Before there was even the idea of you, long before there was any earth for you to stand on, before there were oceans or clouds or the faintest outline of life, there were stars burning themselves out in places so distant their light still travels toward us now. These were massive suns, far larger than the one that warms our days, living brief and furious lives. When such stars exhausted their fuel, they collapsed and exploded in supernova. Brilliant deaths that outshone entire galaxies for weeks at a time. In those last moments, inside pressures and temperatures we can hardly imagine. The simplest elements, hydrogen and helium fused into heavier ones, carbon and oxygen, silicon and iron, gold and uranium, all came from that violence. Every atom in your bones and blood was built there, in a furnace you will never see. But that was once as real and blazing as our own star, the iron that carries oxygen through your body. Giving your blood its deep red came from the heart of a star that died long before the sun was born. Calcium, which strengthens your bones and makes teeth solid, came from similar explosions scattered across space. Even the gold in a wedding ring or the iodine that keeps your thyroid alive had their origins in ancient stellar deaths. When astronomer Carl Sagan said in the 1980s that we are star stuff, it was not poetry alone but physics. Spectrometers have traced the fingerprints of these elements in the light of distant nebulae. Meteorites that fall to Earth still hold isotopes formed in stellar cores, billions of years before the solar system coalesced. Think of what this means. Before there were humans, before there was even a planet to hold water and stone. The materials of your body, traveled the dark between suns. Clouds of gas and dust swirled in the Milky Way, enriched by countless earlier lives of stars. Over millions of years, those clouds cooled and collapsed under gravity, spinning into the flat disk that would become our solar system. About 4.6 billion years ago, in that disk, the sun ignited. Around it, small worlds gathered from leftover debris. Earth was one of these, forming from rocks and ice and metal that had once been light shining across the void. In its molten youth, heavy elements sank to the core, lighter ones floated upward. The air we breathe and the minerals underfoot were sorted then, long before a single cell took shape. Life itself began to borrow these gifts almost as soon as it could. Carbon became the spine of molecules that copy themselves. Oxygen made possible new energy. Iron found its way into the tiny machines of early cells, helping them carry and transform life's fuel. Over billions of years, those molecules built more and more complex forms, plants gathering sunlight, animals moving and sensing, primates climbing trees. By the time your ancestors appeared, the pattern of stars was already in place inside their blood and bones. When you were conceived, you inherited not only human history, but cosmic history. Half of your DNA came from your father's cells, half from your mother's. But the raw material, the carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, had been drifting and reforming for eons. The iron in your blood may once have been part of a meteorite that fell into a young sea, or part of an ancient fish swimming in the Silurian oceans, or part of some long-vanished forest. Before that, it was part of a supernova so far away that its light would take hundreds of millions of years to cross to where Earth now spins. It is humbling to realize that the universe built you long before you had any say. Your birth was new, but the matter that became you is older than the planet. In a literal sense, you were not nothing before you existed. You were scattered ash and light, the remains of stars spread across space, waiting to be called together. Your cells are libraries of deep time. Every breath you take carries oxygen first, forged in stellar fire, and cycled through oceans and leaves and the lungs of countless animals. Astronomers have given us glimpses of these beginnings. The Hubble and now the James Webb Space Telescope have captured images of stellar nurseries like the Pillars of Creation in the Eagle Nebula, where new suns form from old dust. To look at those photos is to see a version of your own far-off past, clouds where your carbon and calcium once drifted, waiting for gravity to gather them. When a star ends in supernova, its shock wave scatters those elements outward. Some will float for billions of years before coming to rest. Some, against odds we can barely comprehend, end up woven into life that asks where it came from, even if we never know what consciousness is or where it goes. The physical story is already astonishing. You are built of events so ancient and violent that the mind can hardly hold them, yet here they are, arranged into something gentle enough to breathe and wonder. This alone connects the idea of before and after in a way deeper than any single life. Long before you, stars lived and died to make your body possible. Long after you, those same atoms will scatter again to soil, to air, to other creatures, perhaps to drift in space until some new world forms. There is a quiet comfort in knowing that you belong to this larger cycle. Before you were born, you were not nowhere. You were everywhere, spread thin but real, waiting for a brief time to be called into shape. And when you return to that scattering, nothing essential about the matter will be lost. It will go on building and breathing and shining elsewhere. Maybe one day forming part of another child's heartbeat, another forest's green. Another mind asking the same questions. Carl Sagan's phrase is often quoted, but it becomes more striking the longer you think about it. We Are Star Stuff means that birth and death are woven into the fabric of the universe itself. You are not an interruption, but a continuation. The first breath you took was powered by oxygen older than the sun. The last breath you give back will release that same stardust to be used again. In this way, the story of stars is also the story of you, ancient, ongoing, and beautiful beyond measure. If you have ever walked slowly through an old cemetery, you know the way silence there is not quite empty. Even when wind moves through the trees and birds call from the edges, there is a stillness that feels layered, as if the ground is listening. Names carved into stone have softened under rain and frost, yet they hold on. Anna, 1883 to 1912. Jonathan, beloved father. Marie, gone but remembered. Some headstones tilt because roots have pushed them, or time has settled the soil. But the marks endure far longer than memory usually does. Often the people buried beneath have no living relatives left, no one who speaks their names aloud. Still the stones persist, small monuments of love and grief set down by hands that themselves have turned to earth. You stand among them and feel that forgetting is never complete. Something in the land keeps witness. Families also keep their own archives, sometimes without realizing it. A diary stored in a trunk, its paper yellowed and thin, can hold a voice clear as the day it was written. In one house you might find an 1890s ledger of births and deaths, the handwriting careful, the ink faded but steady. In another, bundles of letters tied with string, their edges fraying but the words inside sharp: weather, harvest, heartbreak, plans that turned out differently than hoped. Each entry is a thread across time, binding a life to those who come after, even if the details grow strange. You may not know the woman who wrote April 14th, lilacs in bloom. Father poorly, but reading it you feel the quiet moment of her spring and her worry. Her world flickers back for an instant. Objects can do this too. A watch carried in a pocket every day, its face scratched but still ticking. A quilt hand-stitched by someone whose fingers you never touched. A book with notes in the margin where a grandfather argued with the author long before you existed. These things survive the fading of direct memory. They wait in drawers and attics until one day a child or grandchild opens them and a door cracks to another time. Anthropologists call such items material culture. But the phrase is too dry for what they really are: containers of presence. Keeping safe a little of the person who held them, the earth itself has always been the deepest archive. When Mount Vesuvius erupted on the 24th of August, 79 CE, it buried the Roman town of Pompeii under meters of ash and pumice in a single day. Houses, streets, bakeries, even loaves of bread in ovens were sealed as they were. 19 centuries later, excavators opened those spaces and found entire rooms intact, frescoes bright with red and gold, coins scattered on tables, graffiti scratched into walls with jokes and confessions. Names appeared to Salvius, Julia, Stephanos, caught midlife, and now speaking again. One house held a wax tablet still bearing the marks of accounts. Another a mosaic floor that spelled out Cave Canam, beware of the dog, as if the pet might still be sleeping in some back room. These details make the past human, immediate. People long gone live again for a heartbeat, because their city remembered. Similar revelations emerge wherever earth and accident conspire to keep stories. In peat bogs of northern Europe, Bodhi's thousands of years old surface with hair and fingerprints intact, sacrificed or murdered but preserved in an oxygen-poor embrace. In Egyptian desert sands, sealed tombs hold jars of grain and toys children once played with. At sites of ancient battle, archaeologists find not just weapons but sandals, combs, brooches, traces of daily life stopped mid-motion. Even on beaches like Normandy, relics continue to wash ashore. A soldier's helmet, a rusted canteen, dog tags stamped with names once called across the waves. Such endurance tells us something about forgetting. We imagine that when people vanish and the last who knew them die, they are gone forever. Yet the world itself resists total erasure. Stone keeps marks. Clay keeps fingerprints. Ash hardens into a cast of a body curled to shield itself. Soil keeps pollen and seeds. Ice keeps air. A century, a millennium. Even two do not always succeed at wiping away the moment when a life burned bright. This has always mattered to those who come later. Pilgrims visit graves not only to mourn, but to belong. Standing before an ancestor's stone or holding a diary page creates a chain backward through time. It says, someone walked, loved, struggled, and now you stand on their ground. At Pompeii, tourists walk the stone streets and hear their own footsteps echo off walls that once held laughter and argument. The city is gone, but not silent. It gives back a fragment of the human story without needing anyone alive to tell it. For you, before you were born, the places where your people lived and died were already holding record. Perhaps an old farm field with boundary stones carved by a great-great-grandparent still marks a claim. Perhaps a photograph of a wedding day sits forgotten in a drawer. Perhaps no direct family relic survives, yet the ground where you now walk is full of older human sign. The street plan of your town, the bend of a local river, even the names of hills and neighborhoods often hold centuries of use and memory, whether or not you know them. To realize this is to feel less alone in time. Though our own lives vanish quickly from active memory, though our names may fade from tongues, the world is not indifferent. It bears impressions like soft clay. Each life leaves more than breath. It leaves stories for the patient eye to find. And when you go, something of you will remain in this way too. A house number etched into a foundation. A photograph in a drawer, a recipe card, a scrap of handwriting. Maybe only the way a tree grows where your hands once placed it. Even if no one remembers why, the world will know that you were here. So when you think of what it was like before you were born, you can picture this vast archive, earth and objects, and the quiet patience of matter. You came after countless others who also feared being forgotten, and yet pieces of them still surface. You walk among their traces daily, and when you leave, you too will join this slow memory. Part of the long record that no single mind keeps, but that the world itself refuses to let vanish. There comes a point in all these wanderings through time when the trail goes dim. Not because it ends, but because we cannot follow further. We have traced the seas that shaped continents, the first sparks of life in silent oceans, the hands that reached for color on cave walls, the fall and rise of forgotten cities, the way stars died to give us bones and breath. We have walked among graves and ruins and listened to signals older than the earth. And yet, when we try to imagine what lies just past our own last heartbeat, there is only a door with no name, a place the living cannot enter and bring back truth. That boundary has stood untouched through every age. Emperors and beggars, scientists and saints, all reached it and could not return to map its other side. But the mystery may not be as alien as it seems. We have already known what it is to come from silence. Before you first inhaled air, before you were held and seen, floated in warmth and dark, and did not fear it because there was no fear yet. The shift from that water world to breath and light was unimaginable from inside it. Yet here you are. Perhaps death is not the same, but might carry some echo of that motion, slipping back into something vast and unmeasured. The poets have tried to say it, Homer with his gentle fields of asphodel, Rumi with his returning to the beloved, Emily Dickinson with her carriage stopping before the house of death. But always the words tremble under what they cannot hold. What we know is that everything that has lived before us has crossed it. Oceans kept rolling after each wave of life vanished. Stars continued to burn after whole species disappeared. The caves that caught our ancestors' breath when they painted bison and deer are still there. Cool and quiet, unchanged by all the generations that came and went, Pompeii still keeps its rooms. The great ice still holds bubbles of air older than language. The universe has seen endless comings and goings, and it is still here, immense and calm. In that perspective, our own departure cannot be entirely alien. We are made of what has died before. We have been recycled from endings into beginnings for billions of years. Astronauts, who have floated beyond the Earth, speak of an overview effect, a sense that everything alive shares a single fragile home, and that death itself is part of a larger wholeness. Edgar Mitchell said spaceflight made him feel interconnected with all life and matter. It did not answer what happens after breath, but it made the fear softer, because the self felt less separate. Sailors have said something similar when they lose sight of land. At first terror, then a quiet belonging to the endless sea. Perhaps the final horizon is like that, terrifying, when imagined from shore but gentler once entered. We also know that the universe itself is full of returns. Stars die, but their ashes build new suns and planets. Forests burn, and from the black soil green shoots rise. Glaciers melt, and return as rain and rivers. Even memory, though it falters in individuals, reappears in stones and bones and diaries waiting to be opened. If there is a pattern anywhere, it is not one of simple endings, but of transformation. Of what was before becoming the seed for what comes next. Science, for all its reach, remains honest about this boundary. We can measure brain waves flickering at the moment of death. We can chart oxygen levels and final surges of activity, but beyond that, instruments go silent. Philosophy steps in where data cannot go, but even the wisest have admitted ignorance. Socrates called death the greatest of all human blessings, or perhaps nothing at all, and went calmly to his own. The Buddha refused to describe what lies beyond nirvana, saying only that speculation is not the path to peace. It may be that the unknowing is part of the gift, forcing us to live fully while we have time. So as you arrive at this door you cannot name, it may help to turn back through what you have seen in this long wandering. Oceans older than memory still breathe. Caves still hold painted hands. Stars that died so you could be born still scatter light across the night. You come from them and will return to them in some way, whether as matter, as memory, as something no language can capture. The before and the after are not strangers. They are two ends of the same river. You entered once and learned to breathe. You will leave and perhaps enter again into something as natural and immense. There is a gentle awe in letting the question remain alive, but unanswered. Fear shrinks when wonder grows. To stand at the edge of knowing and feel curiosity instead of dread is a victory of the human spirit. Our ancestors lit fires against the dark and sang, built cities and machines and sent small golden records into space, not because they solved the mystery, but because they wanted their voice to join it. We can do the same. Live, love, build, ask, and then step quietly into what follows. If there is any comfort, it is that the universe seems to love continuance. Nothing is wasted. Not the iron of your blood, not the light in your eyes, not the stories you have touched. They will scatter and seed again. The great door is part of the same house you came from. One day when breath leaves, you may find it less a wall than a passageway, opening into a quiet as patient and deep as the one that once waited before your first cry.